Hi everyone, I'm going to be speaking to you today about examining the roots of climate change denial and how we can begin to reimagine the tree. My name is Angeline Letourneau. My pronouns are she, they. I am a PhD student in environmental sociology in the Department of Resource Economics and Environmental Sociology. I did my undergrad in environmental studies at the University of Alberta, and I spent a lot of time doing fieldwork in land reclamation and environmental assessment, as well as environmental planning. So I spent a lot of time thinking about trees. So today I'm going to be covering SDG 13, which is climate action. So these are the key targets of SDG 13. 13.1, strengthen resilience and adaptive capacity to climate-related hazards and environmental disasters in all countries. 13.2, integrate climate change measures into national policies, strategies, and planning. And 13.3, improve education, awareness raising, and human and institutional capacity on climate change mitigation, adaptation, impact reduction, and early warning. So how are we trending on this target? Not well. The climate crisis remains largely unabated. We're very quickly running out of time to do anything about that. And of course, then there are the naysayers who make a difficult problem that much more difficult. Climate change denial is not something that can be solved by increased information about climate science. It is rooted in the identities and beliefs of those that espouse such opinions. So we cannot just science our way out of this. More information will not change the minds of those that have already chosen not to accept the scientific consensus. So as I said, climate change denial is largely ideological and rooted in the identities of those who align themselves with this perspective. And identities are extremely hard to change. I really like this quote from Shine that illustrates just the depth of change necessary to change someone's identity. So human change, whether at the individual or group level, is a profound psychological dynamic process that involves painful unlearning without loss of ego identity and difficult relearning as one cognitively attempts to restructure one's thoughts, perceptions, feelings, and attitudes. So if we can't rely on more information and we can't change identity quickly or easily, what does that leave us with? And we certainly don't have much time left to act, so we need to come up with answer solutions for that very quickly. So I want you to think about trees as people, with each individual tree representing a single person. And I want you to think about the root system as part of one's identity. So representing all of the complex values and beliefs that make up who we are as individuals. They take in social feedback from the outside world and provide stability or grounding to the individual and gives them that sense of self. So as anyone who has ever lived in a house in a mature neighborhood probably already knows, roots can be extremely destructive. They have this insidious way of destroying foundations, cracking sidewalks. This is a very familiar sight if you've walked along any of the older neighborhoods where I'm based here in Edmonton. And there's a number of ways that arborists would say that you can deal with invasive or undesirable tree roots. So you can install a root barrier, which is essentially an underground wall. It's really expensive. It's quite invasive and difficult to put in, and it's still not foolproof. If roots can go through foundations, they can certainly find their ways through root barriers as well over time. And I would compare installing a root barrier to the time and resources that it would be necessary to change the minds of climate denialists. It would be extremely time and resource intensive And it still might not work. You still might not get an opportunity to change their minds, despite the amount of effort that you'll put into it. Another option for dealing with invasive roots is to cut off the problematic root entirely, which can kill the tree outright if it's an important enough root, or make the tree just really sick or weak and susceptible to being blown down, say if a large windstorm came. And the final option, one that we will not entertain here, is you can just outright cut down the tree. Cutting off or ignoring climate denialists poses a significant threat to achieving our climate targets, surprisingly enough. Obviously, we can't just let these roots grow wherever they want, but the manual management of them is expensive and takes a long time if it is to be done without harming the entire tree. So what do we do? What is ultimately the purpose or goal of a root? It's to get nutrients for the tree, right? Well, you can actually mobilize this to your own advantage. So you're not going to change the nature of a root, or certainly not easily. Still going to try and seek out nutrients or water for this tree. But you can manipulate that root to go into areas that are perhaps more desirable, that aren't your sidewalk or the foundation of your home, by placing greater concentrations of water and fertilizer where you would prefer tree roots go. Because usually when we're having difficulties with sort of a problematic root, it's because the tree is not getting what it needs closer in and around the actual base of the tree. So wherever there is the greatest concentration of water and fertilizer is where the roots will go. They'll take the path of least resistance. And you don't have to convince them to change their very nature or what they're seeking out. You can just use what they are predisposed to seek out to your own advantage. So identity is multidimensional. All of us have different elements that make up who we are. There are the groups we are part of, our personally held values and beliefs, our perceptions of the world. Each of us have these individual packages that comprise who we are as human beings. And so we can think of these values and beliefs as the water and nutrients that a root might pursue. You aren't going to change the values and identities of climate change deniers overnight, and probably not even in the time frame that we actually need to in order to act on climate change. But you can incentivize them to move in the direction you want with fertilizer that they might find more desirable. So for whatever reason, they don't accept the scientific consensus on climate change. There are a number of reasons for why this is, but with less than a decade left to make serious headway on climate action targets, it doesn't really matter what their individual reasons are for denying the science on climate change. What matters is getting them to shift their focus or priorities in such a way that they no longer hinder progress on climate change actions. So because their identities are multidimensional and complex, we need to find something else that matters to them that can be used to draw them towards climate-friendly actions. In other words, what might be a tempting form of fertilizer and water? So for some, this might be jobs. This has been a really big focus, a lot of that kind of economic argument that we see, particularly where I'm based here in Alberta. Lots of concerns about where those fossil fuel dependent jobs now will come from. Another one that gets a little bit less attention, but surprisingly conservation. There's a huge overlap between outdoor recreationists such as sport fishermen and hunters and climate change denial. So how do we apply this to the key targets of SDG 13? 13.1, strengthen resilience and adaptive capacity for climate-related hazards and natural disasters in all countries, is probably one of the easiest ones. Increasing resilience to climate-related hazards doesn't even need to refer to climate change. We know that these events will continue to increase in frequency due to climate change, but simply referring to a graph illustrating the increasing frequency of storms is pretty sufficient to sort of incentivize, hey, maybe we should increase our resilience and infrastructure in order to deal with what is an increasing frequency of hurricanes. Whether that's from climate change or not, beside the point, we can still get them on board without that kind of identity triggering language. 13.2, integrate climate change measures in national policies, strategies, and planning. This one is trickier, but I would be tempted to say that we could appeal to the need to protect clean drinking water, but we've seen how unsuccessful that has been regarding the risk for oil spills from pipelines in the past. So probably maybe not the best option, but this still isn't hopeless. I don't know if you've ever seen these driving around Western Canada on the prairies, but these are often called prairie potholes. They're wetlands that are typically found in farmers' fields or grazelands. Back in the day, they used to just plow over them whenever it would be a dry year, but they provide critical nesting habitat, and the frequent practice of just plowing over them started to affect waterfowl hunting. So groups like Ducks Unlimited started working to preserve these ecosystems. And Ducks Unlimited, if you weren't aware, is predominantly funded by a lot of waterfowl hunters. So again, you're kind of starting to see that overlap between very different, but ultimately goals that kind of have the same end target. So this is a bit of a weak example just because it does involve financial compensation, but my point being is that there's often an overlap between aims and goals that just often haven't been considered. So 13.3, improve education, awareness raising, human and institutional capacity on climate change mitigation, adaptation, impact reduction, and early warning. This is a tough one because, as I've said so many times already, education does not change ideological perspectives. But I do take this as an invitation to think about those who are most vulnerable, whether they believe in climate change or not. This one can be a tough one, especially because, again, there's a big overlap between lots of large landholders that will be immediately affected by climate change, such as we saw in Abbotsford and parts of interior BC, and actually climate change denial concentrations in Canada. So keeping in mind a sort of empathetic mindset as we approach increased climate vulnerability over time. So finding the overlap between the necessary action needed to reduce emissions and the values that are already embedded in climate change denial is key to climate action success in the short time that we have left. How do we find these overlaps? Talk to people. To borrow from adaptive leadership, approach those that may not initially agree with you with curiosity and ask genuine questions. And even if you want to bring up climate change, that can be done in a way that doesn't necessarily lead to further polarization. There was a really cool project done a few years ago, the Alberta Narratives Project, which was part of the Global Narratives Project put on by Climate Outreach, which explored how you can talk to different groups of people about climate change without increasing polarization. So I encourage you to check them out as well. And I hope to contribute to this work with my own research going forward in the future, and I encourage you to do the same as well. So thank you so much. I hope that this left you with some food for thought. And if you have any questions, I would love to hear from you. And my email is just included below. Thank you.